His friends arranged everything. The guards were bribed, the ship was waiting, and the old man would not get up from his cell. In the next 13 minutes, you'll see the moment Western political philosophy was born. Not in a book, but in a 70-year-old man refusing to stand up. You'll understand the argument Socrates made to Crito at dawn and why it still holds. Miss this, and you'll miss the scene that every generation since has had to answer on its own. He would not get up. That is where the story actually begins. Socrates was 70. He had been sentenced to death by a jury of his fellow Athenians a month earlier. The execution had been delayed only because a religious festival required the city to send a ship to the island of Delos, and no executions could be carried out until the ship returned. The ship had now returned. The hemlock was being prepared. And Crito, one of his oldest and wealthiest friends, was at his bedside at dawn trying for the last time to convince him to run. He would not. That is where his life properly ends, and where his life is most honest. Every other scene leads here. To understand why he would not get up, you have to understand who he had been, who he had annoyed, and what he believed was at stake in walking out of a cell he could have walked out of. He was born around 470 BC in Athens. His father, Sophroniskis, was a stonemason. His mother, Phaedo, was a midwife. Lesson 2. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates later said his method of philosophy was the midwife's. He did not deliver ideas. He delivered them out of other people. If the idea turned out to be stillborn, it was not his fault. It had been the person's own child. He served as an Athenian hoplite in 3 campaigns. He fought at Potidæa, at Delium, at Amphipolis. Plato records that in the retreat from Delium, he walked calmly while others fled, and that his bearing was so steady, no enemy wanted to be the first to engage him. He was physically tough. He drank heavily without getting drunk. He could stand motionless for hours thinking. Once, during the siege of Potidæa, he stood in one spot from dawn to the following dawn, working through a problem, and the soldiers brought their bedding out to watch him. He was not a professional philosopher. Athens did not really have those. He was a stonemason's son who had stopped doing stonework and now wandered the agora asking questions. The questions were the method. He would find someone who claimed to know something, a general who claimed to know courage, a priest who claimed to know piety, a politician who claimed to know justice. He would ask them to define the thing. The definition would come. He would then apply it carefully to cases until it broke. The man would be forced to admit he did not actually know what he had claimed to know. Socrates would go home and, presumably, do it again the next morning. If this, a full life, start to sell in one Tuesday, is the thing you want more of, subscribe. It's the only signal I need. He said famously that the oracle at Delphi had declared no man wiser than Socrates. He said he had set out to disprove it. He had questioned the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen. He had found that the politicians did not know what they claimed. The poets could not explain their own poems, and the craftsmen, who actually knew their trade, had then assumed they knew everything else as well. He had concluded that the oracle was correct for a narrow reason. He alone, he said, knew that he did not know. That was the only wisdom he had. The people he questioned rarely thanked him. He humiliated them in public, in front of their students, often in front of crowds. He did it without heat. He claimed to want only the truth. Whether he actually wanted something else as well, a kind of corrective vengeance against the confident, is a question the centuries have never settled. He had students, young aristocratic Athenians, Plato, who would preserve him, Xenophon, who would preserve a different version, Alcibiades, brilliant and ruinous, who would go on to betray Athens twice. That last association is probably what killed him, though it was not what the indictment said. In 404 BC, Athens lost the long war with Sparta. A pro-Spartan oligarchy, the 30 Tyrants, seized power and spent a year executing citizens and confiscating property. Some of the worst of the 30 had been in Socrates' circle, including Critias, his former student. When democracy was restored in 403, the city was raw. It did not prosecute the surviving oligarchs under an amnesty. But 5 years later, in 399, 3 ordinary citizens, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, brought Socrates to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. The charges were a cover. Everyone knew what he was really being tried for. He had trained Alcibiades. He had trained Critias. He had, for 40 years, been teaching young men to question everything their fathers had taught them, and some of those young men had grown up to dismantle the city. The trial was held in front of a jury of 500 citizens, chosen by lot. Socrates gave the speech Plato recorded in the Apology. He did not grovel. He did not apologize. He said he had been a gift to Athens, a gadfly stinging a large and sluggish horse into wakefulness, that if they killed him, they would not find another like him easily, that he would not stop philosophizing even if they released him on condition he stop. The jury found him guilty by a narrow margin. Athenian law then required both sides to propose a punishment. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates, by custom, was expected to propose exile or a significant fine, which the jury would then choose between. He proposed that the city should feed him at public expense for the rest of his life, as it fed Olympic victors, since he had served Athens better than any athlete. The jury, which might have spared him, chose death by a wider margin than the conviction itself. He had pushed them into it. Some readers have always suspected that he wanted the verdict, that at 70, with his body starting to fail, he had decided that the most useful thing he could do for his method was to die for it, clearly in front of witnesses, rather than dwindle into an old man the city ignored. He spent a month in the state prison while the ship was away at Delos. His friends visited. His wife Xanthippe came with the children. He talked with visitors every day. Crito came at dawn on what everyone knew was nearly the last morning and tried to convince him to escape. The argument Crito made was practical. The escape was arranged. Socrates' death would leave his young sons fatherless. It would shame his friends, who would look as if they had failed him. It was still possible. It only required him to walk out. Socrates refused, and the reasons he gave are the beginning of Western political philosophy. He said he had lived his whole life under the laws of Athens. He had enjoyed their protection. He had married, raised children, fought in the army, taught in the streets, all under those laws. If he now, when the laws had finally turned on him, escaped in the night, he would be saying that laws were binding only when he agreed with them. That was not a philosophy he could live by, and he would not die by it either. He had made an agreement with the city, implicitly, over 70 years. The city was now calling it in. He would pay. If you've made it here, the next 8 minutes are the argument. The scene at dawn, Crito in the cell, the door unlocked, the ship ready. And the single reason, the founding reason of Western political philosophy, that an old man would not stand up and walk through it. There was also something simpler behind it. He had spent his life saying that death was either nothing or a transition, and that neither was to be feared. If he ran now, he would be admitting he had been lying to his students for decades. He stayed. He would not get up. The Phaedo is Plato's account of the last day, told by a student who was there. Socrates bathed. He dismissed his wife because her crying, he said, made it harder for him. He spent the day in conversation about the immortality of the soul. He was by turns serious and playful. His friends wept. He scolded them gently for weeping. At sunset, the officer of the 11 came in with the cup. He apologized before handing it over. He said Socrates was the noblest and gentlest and best of all men who had ever come to this place, and he turned away in tears. Socrates took the cup without any tremor, asked whether he should pour a libation first, was told there was only enough for the dose, and drank it in one draught. He walked around the cell until his legs grew heavy. Then he lay down. The executioner pressed his foot, asked if he could feel it. Socrates said no. The numbness moved upward. When it reached his waist, he uncovered his face. He had covered it, by custom, to die in private. He said, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please do not forget to pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing. You sacrificed a rooster when you recovered from an illness. That is what he said with his last breath. Ask yourself, while no one is watching, the friends in your life right now, which one is offering you the bribed boat? Which one is sitting in the cell with you, asking you not to use it? And what is the argument you would have to make to them, out loud, that would justify staying? That life had been a sickness, and death was the recovery. That the transaction was complete. Then he died. Phaedo says he was the best and wisest and most just man he had ever known. It is a student's line. It is also, as far as any student in that room could see, true. Socrates left no writing. Everything we have is through Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes, and a few others, all of whom disagreed. The real Socrates is partly unrecoverable. What survived is the method and the scene. A man who would rather die than stop asking questions, and who, when asked to save himself by escaping the laws he had lived by, said no, because saying yes would have been the real death. Athens regretted it almost immediately. Within a few years, the accusers were disgraced, and a bronze statue of the man they had killed was set up in the city. It was too late, of course. But Athens did not need him alive to keep the lesson. He had made sure of that in the way he chose to die. He could have walked out. The ship was ready. The guards were bribed. There is a detail from the trial that readers sometimes miss. When he was offered the chance to propose his own punishment, Athenian custom expected a decent fine or a dignified exile. Many in the jury, even those who had voted to convict, were waiting for him to give them a way to let him live. He understood this perfectly. He simply thought accepting the offer would mean the trial had been legitimate, in a way he did not believe it was. To accept exile would be to admit the charge. To pay a fine would be to call his philosophy a misdemeanor. He would not do either. He preferred the verdict to be clean. If they were going to kill him for asking questions, he would not help them pretend it was about anything else. His friends could not understand it at the time. Crito, in the cell, argued that the law had been misapplied and that obeying a misapplied law wasn't justice. Socrates answered that even then, the agreement had been with the laws as a whole, not with this particular application of them, and that breaking the agreement now would undermine the very system he had depended on his entire life. The argument is not airtight. Later, philosophers have picked it apart for centuries. But the point was not the argument. The point was the stance. He had decided, long before the trial, what kind of man he intended to be at the end of it. The reasoning came second. He could have walked out. The ship was ready. The guards were bribed. To accept exile would be to admit the charge. To pay a fine would be to call his philosophy a misdemeanor. He would not do either. If they were going to kill him for asking questions, he would not help them pretend it was about anything else. He would not get up. That was the argument. If this one reached you, subscribe. That's how the channel stays alive. If Socrates landed, the next one you want is Diogenes, the student of a student who took everything Socrates taught and made it homeless, barefoot, and louder. I'll put it right here on the end screen. Diogenes lived in a clay jar in the street. When Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, stood over him and said, "Ask me for anything you wish," the old beggar looked up and told the king, "Stand out of my light." Click it.